Hello, thank you for coming to this talk right at the end of this day, which I believe is the first day of DrupalCon, actually, Vienna. This is some of the information, the content, the things that we've learned about the secret lives of designers contributing to open source software. So we're going to dive into what we think is some of the most important stuff that we learned doing a research report. Just to cover really quickly who we work for and what the organisation that produced this research do. We work at Superbloom. Superbloom is a design and research non-profit that's changing who technology serves. We do this by leveraging design and design methodologies, ways of doing design to shift power in the technology ecosystem. We used to be called something different. We used to be called Simply Secure, so that might be a name that pops up if you search for us as well. That is also us, or was us. We're an international team. Our expertise is across user research and different research methods, design of all different kinds, UI, UX, other kinds of design, software development and product management, and we're supported by a different and diverse set of advisors and partners, and have been working with the internet freedom space, human-centered design, and public interest technology or civic tech since we were founded as Simply Secure in 2015. And predominantly a lot of the work that we do for organizations, either they are open source organizations or have open source projects that we work on as the design aspects of those projects. I'm Eriol. Pronouns are she, her, they, them. I've been doing design for almost, over 15 years now, probably coming up to 16. I lose count after a while. I've been in the open source software space, working as a designer and contributing as a design volunteer for over 7 years now. And I've been at Superbloom, the organisation that I just described, for just over 4 years. I am one of the core maintainers at opensourcedesign.net. They are dedicated, as an organisation, they are dedicated to helping open source software projects get better access to designers. It's a place where designers can go when they start to think about contributing to open source or wonder what contributing to open source might be like. So it's more of a community project more than, say, maintaining a software tool, although we do maintain a jobs board, which is where open source projects can post things that they want design contributions for, or if they have a paid role or paid work going, they can also advertise it there for designers. You also might recognise my voice from the Sustain Open Source Software podcast if you're a podcast listener. We also have a number of episodes that are dedicated to design on the SOS Design Sustain organisation URL on the screen at the moment.
Hi, my name is Victory Brown and I'll be co-presenting with Eriol today. I'm also an open source designer and I've been contributing to open source design for over 5 years now. I'm still new, but I have done a lot of things in this space, from communities to programs, and also like advocating for design. I do a lot of content design, advocacy, and user-centered design, and I also work at Superbloom. I was a contractor and now I work full-time, and I've been there 2 years. I also lead a design community back home in Nigeria because I'm coming from Nigeria. So yeah, we've been doing design for quite a long time, and we're excited to talk about this research project.
So this research document that you can read online in the GitHub repository, there's a URL on the screen at the moment. It should redirect you to our newly named GitHub organization, but that's the where you can find the document for all this research, both the raw data and also like our compiled thoughts around the data. But it was funded in 2022 by Vermont Complex Systems over at the University of Vermont. It was an Ocean grant, which investigates and offers funding for under-researched aspects of open source. And so they were really interested in how we wanted to engage with designers contributing to open source and understand better what their experiences were and how we can learn how to make that better, that kind of contribution better. So we were awarded some money to investigate and give designers who are currently contributing to open source an opportunity to describe these experiences in an environment which felt safe and anonymous and privacy respecting. There's not a lot of designers doing design in open source, so it's actually quite easy to identify them if you just know the project name and that they're doing design there. So we kept everything as anonymous and private and secure as possible. Which means that sadly we weren't able to name the projects the designers were contributing to, but they're kind of described in a way. So it's either like an open source operating system or an open source community project. So the research project aimed to investigate some key questions related to design in open source and fill in the larger gaps of information around non-code contributions and experiences in open source. So this information was about both like GUI design, GUI design, UI design, user research, and we understand often that open source tools are, the design is initially tends to be done by those that found the open source. Typically a coder of some description, a developer, somebody writing the code, tends to make the design decisions as well. And rarely do open source designers or designers that are interested in open source have ability to contribute at the beginning of a project. And it's really difficult to understand where these roles and boundaries do lie, but often developers that are designing the open source from the start don't tend to call themselves designers. So the people that are in our study are people that are self-describing as designers and making design contributions. Whether or not they started out like that is not always the case. Often open source designers do sometimes start out as developers as well. But this kind of design for open source is rarely done by developers that will say that they feel proficient in design skills. Often they're kind of filling a gap, like they know some good principles or they have access to some design knowledge, but they often speak about really needing more support from people that are specialized in design or that are really interested in design. So some of the research questions that we were asking the designers for this diary study, and if people are unfamiliar with a diary study, you give a period of time, people respond to a set of questions over a period of time. This research study was done between 10 and 16 weeks, so designers were offering information via a series of questions in an online survey. They were also offered other ways to give their insight and feedback other than a sort of written survey base. But they were offering like weekly, this is what I've been up to, this is what I've been doing, and it was a series of very specific questions, which you can find all of the questions that we were asking on a weekly basis in the repository, so you can see exactly what we were asking. But the questions broadly that we wanted to understand from this research are: what are the experiences that designers contributing to open source software commonly have? What are the conditions that set designers up for success in an open source software project, and in that, how do designers define success for them when they're contributing to an open source project? And what conditions create a sense of inclusion, both at a project, open source project level, community level, and for the designers specifically in open source software? There were other research questions, again, you can find them on the repository, but there's just a selection of some. We paid each of the designers. We studied with only 5 designers for this diary study, given the amount of grant money that we had for this research, but we paid each designer for their contributions because we believe that contributions that are worth learning about are worth paying for. So from the grant money, we paid each designer $1,000 USD for completing the 10 full weeks of diary study entries on their contributions to open source. But this is a little bit of information about the kinds of designers that we were studying with. So you've got different people working part-time or full-time. You've got people with different kind of employment statuses. You've got different people in levels, like whether they're studying currently at the point of the diary study, and how many open source projects roughly they're contributing to regularly, or what they would say. There's a few other pieces of information that are again in the data about the global locations of people. So we had somebody from the US, somebody from Canada, Nigeria, Brazil, and Germany. Obviously this doesn't cover the entire globe. We'd like to do more research with designers in different places, but this is what we started with. So the first aspect of the research that I'd like to dig into is about collaboration between designers and developers. It was a recurring theme on a weekly basis from the designers in the diary information that they were offering us. And at some point, all of the designers in the study used either GitHub or GitLab. And these were traditionally by the designers seen as tools for developers. and they were seen as tools for communication and collaboration primarily with developers. But the participants had such a struggle with these tools. No matter how long they had been using these tools, they were still a struggle to use because they weren't really fit for the purpose of design artifacts or design contributions. They're kind of catered towards a certain kind of contribution, typically code, maybe a little bit more documentation now. So this is some of the quotes from the designers from the study. So I'm not sure the best way to use GitLab for design tickets. Like, how do you, when you come to write a design ticket, how do you even kind of use the parts of the GitLab or GitHub interface in order to accurately describe a design ticket when it's kind of primarily about written information and maybe a screenshot here or there. Contextually, it's quite hard to isolate aspects of visual design in these tools. And then the second one, so funny, one talk, I had some people from GitLab listen to this talk, and then I had to read this out from the screen. I hate GitLab. It's confusing, and the team did not put me as a developer yet. And this comment speaks to the experience of designers not receiving the same status as other people in repositories as far as like what they could do, like assigning themselves to issues and other kinds of aspects. So this aspect of collaboration was often about negotiating what a designer needed access to, what they were assumed to need access to from a kind of developer perspective. And really, if a developer doesn't, or a person maintaining open source doesn't kind of have an idea of what designers would like access to, and they don't know how to ask those questions, or the designers don't know what to ask for, again, you're just going to have a whole kind of breakdown in like, I don't know what to ask for and I don't know what to give. So we're hoping that people that are learning this now will now know what to ask for and what to offer. But designers found that they were met with the read the manual response quite a lot. To like common questions. So they were really, designers typically want to really understand what an open source project really wants to achieve at a greater goal level. And often when they were asking those questions, they either didn't know where to ask those questions, like what mechanism for communication really is there for that, like immediate answers to questions. Or if they were asking those questions to individuals that they could identify as maintainers, they often then got met with the read the manual, go like find it yourself, that's what open source is about. But designers really aren't kind of, don't have that background and that built in to go seek that information. They're much more often social and conversational with how they seek information about the tools that they want to contribute to. And neither way is wrong, if you know what I mean. I'm just kind of exposing the differences between like how designers really want to ask questions, and that kind of isn't necessarily always the way that open source projects are kind of set up to encourage and support. Developers were really involved with the design processes, though, when the design processes were able to be found. And getting responses from developers about design proposals was typically pretty easy for the designers in the study. But there's kind of a bias here in the sense that it was often easier for coders and developers and open source maintainers to give feedback on the design and a certain opinion about how the open source should be designed. And generally that was welcomed by the designers. They really wanted any kind of interaction and feedback that they could get. But it was really difficult and frustrating when the same or similar opportunities for designers to participate in coding related topics wasn't extended the other way. So it was often assumed that a designer wouldn't be interested in the conversations about how we're rebuilding our API or refactoring or rebasing the code base or things like that. It was just assumed that wasn't of interest, but it's not true. The designers really wanted to be involved in these conversations in some way as well. So in that way, designers were often either self-selected themselves out of like too technical discussions, or they were just not included, so they just didn't know that they were happening. And there was like an assumed level of lack of proficiency in the technological, infrastructural aspects of open source. And all the designer participants mentioned getting feedback from developers as a crucial, important, huge bonus to their existence in open source as well. They hugely valued when any open source contributor from a project interacted with them and worked with them and collaborated. Again, a couple of quotes. We've got, I made a user flow diagram to make my designs more comprehensible, and a developer found my organized Figma files useful. These seem like quite small successes, but to designers these, again, are huge. The fact that a design file that was organized well was really useful to the project is a huge bonus to designers. They feel really great about that contribution. And they were really focused on how they could make design and how they were choosing how to make design more comprehensible in what they were contributing. And this helped them feel like personally fulfilled, like they were able to really improve the methods of collaboration, or they felt like they were improving the methods of collaboration. So the rest of the talk we're going to focus on success, metrics of success that the designers self-described in the study. And I'm going to focus on 2 for this talk because we don't have a lot of time left. So the first one I'm going to talk about, you're going to talk about feedback. You're going to talk about
Yeah, so hi. Talking about how designers have measured success in their contribution to open source. I think earlier on, Eriol showed a slide about developer-designers collaboration, and one of the ways is through feedback. Feedback is quite important to designers. I mean, we say our work has been a success when we get feedback that is relevant and useful. It's very important that it's relevant and useful. And relevance is, it's nice, it's not irrelevant feedback to a designer. This looks nice, it doesn't sound like irrelevant feedback. Relevant feedback has to do with the design work itself. Useful feedback has to do with the collaboration and if the design is what is needed for that project. So designers tend to assume that they've got it right if they don't get any feedback, and that's typically for the more professional or experienced designers. But designers who are new to open source would require feedback because otherwise they think that they've not done a good job or their collaboration or contribution is not valued. So if you are a leader in an open source organization and you have designers contributing, it's very important that they get feedback. Also, another thing that could be viewed as negative feedback or viewed negatively is slow feedback, which is no feedback sometimes. And we do understand that the open source space, people are busy, people are working, but I mean, just a message on Slack saying I'll get to this shortly is good enough for a designer to know that they have been seen, they have been noticed, and their work is in line of being reviewed. So the lack of communication is seen as a progress blocker. So if you are a team lead, please give feedback to designers. We have a quote here that says, when I get feedback on what's wrong in my design and get the next steps that are actionable. So that's coming from a designer who has contributed. It also says there was a delay in feedback from my prior conversations with the maintainer and I was unable to kick off immediately. So slow feedback actually hinders designers from making progress on their work, because sometimes we need to know if this is a go ahead, if we can take the step to move forward on that project. Another one that we'd like to talk about is success via knowing what is a priority for the OSS project. Unlike developers who can track priorities on issues, GitHub issues, and also like knowing what's next for the project because they consistently have team meetings, designers are not always brought into that conversation, so we don't know what's next. It's very important that it is highlighted. And measuring progress on priorities was difficult as one designer spoke consistently of the need for a product or project manager to guide them through. Right? I think for me, when I talk about this, it looks to me that when you give room for designers to make collaboration, they also give room for other non-code contributions to be made. So you're giving room for a project manager to step into your project and take ownership of things. And it doesn't have to be a very tedious step. You don't have to set up databases or anything. Just on Slack, just through instant messaging or through the mailing list, you can communicate what is expected of a designer contributing to your project. Designers have employed a lot of tactics in order to better understand priorities. Sometimes we go ahead and be proactive and do things ahead of time, and sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not, but just so that we are actively involved in the project, you see designers take this first step. So for us to make better use of our time, it'll be very good to communicate what these priorities are and what is needed of a designer. Not much of a hack, but I've started to get important stakeholders, often project leads, to sketch out their ideas more so that I know what they're thinking. And that's a very good quote, because I understand how this can come off. Sometimes project owners have something to say, but they're not able to explain that or communicate it effectively to a designer. So whatever means you can do this through sketches. I remember Eriol on one of our talks say you can make a phone call, you can drop a picture, you can send an Instagram link, just something to communicate what is expected is very good, as long as there is communication. Okay, so from this research we found out a lot of things. The long circle of communication in OSS, it's also like it has been a challenge. Processes, who makes decisions and how are they made. Designers are often left out of these conversations, right? Like if you join an open source organization for the first time, typically you don't always know who the maintainer is, who the project lead is, because we often find projects as designers by stumbling into a community or finding them on the opensource.net page. So these are very important things for project owners to make clear, either on your documentation or your website, like who is the go-to person for this project, who are the users, what are we building, and who are we building it for. It's very important for us to know that. Dealing with an overwhelming amount of design work as well. Being paid for OSS contributions. This is things that people talked about, how important it is that their work is recognized in different levels. So it could be through visibility, through being paid, stipends, or gratis, whatever way works. So designers in OSS and their busy lives, those are the things that we found out from this research as well. So what might make designers leave an OSS project? People leave OSS projects all the time, and one of the things that we talk about is burnout, but they are not, that's like a global experience, but there are certain things that pertain to designers that we need to touch on. So designers of direct study had many challenges, mostly centering around communications, right? Delegation, just knowing who is the lead and how much of their time is to be put into that project. So some of the things that could make designers leave, one, if the design work is done and continues to be done in an open design software, like if there's continuity of it and they've set up all of those templates and things that ensure that the project can go on without them, they're good to go. If the design is left in a way that other people can pick up and understand. So when we do design, we don't see design as a one-off contribution. We see design as a continuous thing, and sometimes projects don't always view design contributions as such, right? But it's something that we want people to see, that design is not one-off. We contribute in such a way that we want to leave and then someone else can pick up from where we stop. So it's by creating so many things, templates, automated documentation, just something that other designers can pick up as well. Sometimes we leave OSS places to find a better place in terms of design. So if we're not getting what we want from a project in terms of offering our design services, we can move to other projects that we feel will value what we want to do. To plan the structure for the OSS, to not just recognize design contributions but document them well too. We document a lot of things for developers. If you go to projects, you would always see things for how to contribute via code, and even on GitHub it's documented on how developers can contribute developer issues, but we don't see many of this in the design space, and that's something that we want to see more, and we urge projects to plan structures for OSS. We also want to know the design will change after you're gone. OSS is about sharing and the willingness to accept changes, right? And design is such a very personal thing to some designers. I know I don't really like to have my design touched, but it's when you contribute in an open way, it's one of those things that you're open to collaboration, feedback from both the users, the project owners, and even the community people as well. Yeah, so you can find all of these on the GitHub link, so you can search this out and you will find a full report on everything that we saw. Just before I go, as an OSS project, one of the recommendations is that you should take note of the ways in which designers decide that they want to offer their design to an OSS project. So some of those indicators of design should include, like, is this project clear enough? Like, what's the problem statement? Who are we building for? What's the audience that we're trying to serve? and is this a one-person project, and is this still active? Sometimes we see projects, we see design issues, and then we make those changes, but the project is not active. There's nobody there to speak to. There's nobody telling you, oh, like, yeah, we're not longer, this project doesn't work anymore. So you're just met with a ghost, and sometimes it's not helpful to a designer. So it's really important to know, and also knowing if it's a one-person project helps a designer to know how much time they are contributing, if their contribution is also valued, and like just knowing who to go to for help and support and questions. So yeah, over to Eriol.
So there's a series of recommendations in the document. There's also tons of other information about that we haven't gone into on the time that we've had, because we've gone a little over time as well. But one of the other recommendations to highlight is figuring out what your healthy feedback cycle looks to you in your open source project. That doesn't have to be whatever you regard as quick, as long as it's stated somewhere in the open source project. Hey, I do this in my spare time, I'm a lone maintainer, I'm going to get back to you maybe within 6 months. As long as you're saying that, designers are totally chill with that, as long as it's said. But when it's not stated anywhere, a designer doesn't know how to what expectations they can have of feedback processes. And as we said, feedback for designers is really important in open source, so that they know that they're helping you solve a problem. They also would love to know when it's going to be implemented, if at all, if possible, understanding the priorities, who decides what those priorities are, if it's like a benevolent dictator for life situation or a committee situation. And being acknowledged positively. So as Victoria was saying, it doesn't have to be about getting paid to do open source, although we were curious to know whether designers expected that in the report. Sometimes it's about, like, how do designers want to be recognized differently? And just a little tidbit of information is like having like your contributor bot be in a GitHub page is sometimes great for people that are like really pro and GitHub profile like metrics. Designers aren't going to their job interviews with their GitHub profile to be hired. They're usually like sharing design on different platforms that aren't necessarily open source. So if you want to attract design contributions, you might have to think about how you help your designers and how you're promoting them off of open source platforms, because they do exist there and it's just a reality. Like, are you shouting them out on LinkedIn or any other social media that is of benefit to them? Because they do want to be recognized and valued. With that, please read the GitHub of the document, add issues if you have questions. I think we've got maybe a couple of minutes for questions, but we would love to try and fund this again. We did this project with 5k of funding, 5k USD of funding, and we gave all of that money to the designers. We paid them each 1k for their contributions. The rest of the time, the salary time on writing the report was donated by the organisation Superbloom, because we feel like this needs to be out there for people. So we offered our salary time to work on this. And we'd love to have stuff like this, information from designers about how they're contributing, more regular, more widely shared. And my like personal goal here is, what if there was like a state of the open source design report, like there is the state of the open source for the other aspects. So if you're curious or want to get involved or figure out like how we do more of this, please get in contact. But that's our talk level short version of this massive research project. So thank you for listening. Do we have time for questions?
I think so. I mean, why not?
Don't feel like you have to stay if you want to head off somewhere, but if anyone's got any questions, please let us try and answer them. No. Okay.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
What are the tools that you use for collaboration, actually? I'm a developer, so I have no idea.
There's a whole section of the report about what tools you're using as a designer. Really, a really fascinating section of the report. So designers don't have a lot of open source options. They have some. So you've got GIMP, you've got Inkscape, you've got Penpot app, which is, if you're not familiar with Penpot app, it's like an alternative to Figma. And then, of course, if you're doing design like research, which is often written information, you can create markdown files, or you can use CryptPad or LibreOffice for those things. But the key thing is that most designers aren't discovering these open source alternatives until they have learned about their existence. Designers like educational background and just community-based learning both promotes proprietary tooling. Currently, although it's changing a little bit, there are now courses for designers in educational institutions that are prioritizing open source tools. But culturally, again, like I kind of mentioned earlier, if a designer is trying to maintain employment, either in an open source space or proprietary space, then using open source tooling when they go to interviews where there's a design director that's never heard of these tools but has heard of Adobe and Figma, it's like designers are having to make trade-offs to use open source tools because they're not really valued in the design world yet. I'd like this to change. I'd like people outside of the open source space that are hiring designers to be like, oh, you contribute to open source as a designer, that's really cool. Because I think my impression of developers is when you go to get hired at new places, they look at what open source you might be contributing to and how you're engaging in some way if you're doing it. Whereas for designers, most of the people that are going to be hiring us don't know what that means, like largely. They don't expect it and they don't know what it means. So it's actually a big career risk at the moment for designers to contribute to open source. They do mostly do it because they're really interested in the purpose of the project, or like they somehow have gotten really nerdy about open source, like many of us in open source somehow get like brought into the cool, like, oh, I'm learning new things aspect. But yeah, there's a whole section. Any other questions? They don't have to be polite. If you've got like questions that you think might be offensive to designers, please ask them.
Yeah, okay, so next question is, it seems like a lot of, like, there's problems in communication, I think, between developers and designers. And, I mean, normally I would think this is the task of the project manager, but probably, I don't know, and I haven't contributed much in open source projects yet, but I believe that they are also, mostly developers are coming from that perspective.
So again, my knowledge base for there are many ways of how coders and developers get involved in open source projects, but typically you get kind of taught that, or you're either taught that you are using open source programming languages, maybe in your computer science courses or as you're learning, and you learn the process of, I've experienced a bug, I'm going to submit a bug, and I might even, if I'm interested in the open source ecosystem, solve that bug for myself. It's kind of the scratching your own itch. And then maybe you also are interested in building something, and again, it's like the scratching your own itch, but it's very like what I understand of how coders get, and maybe even other kind of technical, you could describe them as technical expertises, get involved and they know how to self-serve the information. Either they're using the tool, they experience the bug, they can fix the bug themselves. Whereas designers aren't always using the tool themselves and sometimes might not want to or can't. And that shouldn't be a barrier to contributing good design to open source, is not using the tool. Which might be a controversial statement for some people because, you know. But yeah, I think a lot of the struggles with communication is designers are coming in with no prior like support or education about how to self-serve that. Okay, I use it, I experience a bug, I fix my bug. Designers are coming in like, hey, your project seems cool, I really want to help out, how can I help out? Which is a very different, or quite a different route I've heard coming into open source. So I think that's often where the communication breaks down, because I think the expectation of open source projects is that you have those base skills to like seek a problem yourself, try to fix a problem, send a PR, know how to work through a commenting system, whereas most designers are coming out with no knowledge of that. unless, and they do exist, they're a designer that has transitioned from like a computer science coding background to design, and they do exist. Great question, though. Thank you. Any other questions, or we need to finish?
Just one question.
Please, yeah.
On the size of the open source projects,
Mm,
because some projects are much bigger than others.
yeah.
Was that in any way factored into the study?
Yeah, so in the study, we had people contributing to one person that I remember off the top of my head was contributing to a very large open source operating system,
Right.
and had been for many, many, many years. And then we've got people that were contributing to quite significant like metrics-based open source projects, some community projects. Some people were primarily doing their design contributions to like open source conferences. So you're kind of like designing the swag. Often that's how designers get involved in open source, is by designing the swag or the logo.
Yeah, I was also thinking that you mentioned the project managers, and I think, for example, in Drupal, which the kind of the design involvement in Drupal took a long time, and I think was mainly because at some point I think Drupal kind of realized, I don't know exactly how it happened, but realized there was some sort of lack of authority or empowerment of those designers.
Yeah.
There was good incentives, but really, ultimately, they kind of faced the wall. So bringing someone with authority on the project to make sure that happens was kind of unlocked.
Exactly what you're saying. So the person working on the operating systems, there's a quote in the report, and it's a really sad quote because it's a quote that says something like, I feel like I have no idea what parts of the open source I might affect if I'm trying to change something over here, and I don't know who I can ask, because I'm treated very differently to the person dealing in this aspect of the open source, to the people I regularly interact with. And there just wasn't that level of value and respect outside of the core team that they'd been contributing to, like the core aspect of the operating system. What I think can help solve this is basically what you've described, is what if we as open source projects consider what it would take to be a design maintainer. Like, we have maintainers, and we sort of assume that maintainers kind of cover pretty much every aspect of maintaining an open source project, but typically the code quality is often how the default is. But what if we began defining, okay, well, you can be the documentation maintainer, the code, the back-end code, or however a project is structured. But I think there's great power in thinking about what it means to be a design maintainer of an open source project. Are you all bored of talking about design stuff now, or is there any other questions that you print out? I could go forever with this, but please don't feel like you have to stay. We can close out, but thank you very much for listening. Please enjoy the report and watch this space, hopefully, for the next round of funding and working on this kind of research.